Warfare finally become a reality between the world's two most powerful nations. This week, we learned that some of the Chinese hackers who've been targeting hundreds of American companies appear to be working for the People's Liberation Army. And even more alarming, evidence that hackers may have key infrastructure in their crosshairs. Things like oil pipelines, the power grid, air traffic control. China hotly denies the charges, but the White House is raising the pressure, and the specter of trade sanctions looms to protect trade secrets. Chinese military involvement would take that hacking threat to a whole new level. It's something U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta warned about in a speech last October.
The collective result of these kinds of attacks could be a cyber Pearl Harbor, an attack that would cause physical destruction and the loss of life, an attack that would paralyze and shock the nation and create a new profound sense of vulnerability.
In other words, it's been reported that the United States itself has launched cyber attacks, in particular on Iran's nuclear program. But in a major report, the New York Times traced a group of Chinese cyber warriors to the doorstep of this building, a 12-story office tower in Shanghai. That's the headquarters of a special military cell called Unit 61398. I spoke about this ominous new twist with David Sanger, who wrote the story for the Times, and he joined me from Harvard. David Sanger, welcome to the program.
Good to be back with you, Christiane.
And an amazing story you've got on the front page of the New York Times. I mean, in a nutshell, all of these suspicions that we've had about cyber attacks and cyber warfare, you know, stealing trade secrets and all the rest of it, now you're saying that a new group has traced it back, what, conclusively to the Chinese army?
I would say that they have made a very strong circumstantial case that it is coming from a PLA unit called 61398 that's located in a 12-story building in Shanghai. My colleague David Barboza wrote the story with me along with Nicole Perroth. He went out to the building last week. It dominates a sort of rundown neighborhood in Shanghai. It's got thousands of people working in it. The group that did the trace back of the attacks done by a group called Comment Crew, which is probably one of the largest of the Chinese hacking groups, they were able to take most of the digital forensics right back to the gates of this building. They couldn't take it inside for all kinds of reasons we describe in the story, but if it's not coming from this building, then you've got to believe it's coming from the noodle shops and restaurants that surround this building.
Mm-hmm. So, David, what exactly are they doing? What is the purpose, if it's true that it's the PLA, doing?
Well, there are two elements of this. There's espionage, which is most of what the world has seen Chinese hacking groups do. And then there's infrastructure attacks to take over infrastructure. Let's deal with the first. Many American corporations have seen their intellectual property stolen. That's pretty classic industrial espionage. But if it's being done with state sponsorship, then the question is China turning its covert and its military forces over to help state-run industries or even perhaps non-state-run Chinese industries? The more worrisome kind of attacks are the infrastructure attacks. That's when you go in to learn the code work or the software to take over an oil pipeline or an electric plant or something like that. And on this, remember, Christiane, American hands are not clean. Got into the Iranian nuclear program.
You just mentioned Stuxnet, and the big story, of course, which you broke, and you've written a lot about it, is the cyber warfare against the Iranian nuclear facilities. The U.S. is doing this kind of stuff as well. So what kind of a relationship does the U.S. have with China when it comes to cyber warfare?
You may recall that when I reported on Stuxnet and Olympic Games, which was the code word for the U.S. program, that President Obama said to some of his aides in the Situation Room several years ago that he was worried that once the U.S. went down this road, other countries might use it as a pretense to launch their own attacks. presumably not with the discipline and the rules the U.S. has. Well, I think that's probably pretty much exactly what's happened. Since Stuxnet got out, not because of any revelation of mine, but a operator error that resulted in the program getting free around the web, the Iranians have started their own cyber core, and they're believed to have been responsible for the destruction of about 30,000 computers at Saudi Aramco last summer.
That's the big Saudi Arabian oil company.
That's right. It's the largest of the Saudi Arabian oil companies, and they didn't actually get into the pipelines or refineries, but they did get into their computer systems and considerable damage. That is an indication of where all of this may well be going.
So, David, now the U.S. has to figure out how to counter all of this. And we read in your article and elsewhere that they're trying to formulate responses, both offensive and defensive, as you say, both in cyberspace, but also diplomatically. Apparently, they're going to say something to the Chinese, but they're not going to specifically mention this group and the PLA, because that might have broader implications for the general relationship. How much of a conundrum is the U.S. in just trying to confront this?
This is diplomatically, I think, one of the most complicated problems out there. And I think you got a sense of that from the State of the Union address, which you quoted, because the president spent, what, 2 or 3 paragraphs on cyber. And I think, Christiane, it struck me, probably struck you as well. He spent about a sentence each on the Iranian nuclear crisis, on Syria, and on nuclear proliferation. So it tells you where his head is. And it's been made pretty clear to me that the U.S. plans to go to the Chinese leadership and say, look, this used to be a sideshow. This used to be an annoyance. Now it's at such a level that it is beginning to threaten the underpinnings of the U.S.-Chinese relationship.
David Sanger, thank you very much indeed for joining me. So what does the United States do about this? I want to now turn to former CIA official and Chief of Staff to the Department of Homeland Security, Chad Sweet. He is CEO and global security firm. Mr. Sweet, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you then, you just heard David Sanger. What is being said in the corridors of national security in the United States today after this report?
I think you put your finger on it earlier. The key issue is the issue of a lack of a doctrine of attribution and retribution. And by that I mean if you look at what's going on, we're essentially facing a new Cold War, a cyber Cold War. And in this war, it's a high-stakes game where, as David said, the United States is essentially being relieved of billions of dollars of intellectual property and also threatening our critical infrastructure. And so make no mistake about it, in the corridors of power here in Washington, the question is, how do we move forward in a lack of leadership in the Congress on being able to set forth a doctrine of attribution and retribution?
So how does one? I guess my question is, you mentioned the Cold War, you know, nuclear Armageddon, but of course no nuclear missiles were fired. Here you've got cyber destruction possible. What is the destructive level and capacity of this cyber Cold War?
The destructive capacity, Christiana, is equivalent to that of a nuclear warhead. If you think about it, the ability in this case to essentially extract a devastating attack on critical infrastructure, which could result in the loss of thousands of lives, is possible. But what makes it more sinister than the nuclear age is that there's no easily identifiable plume. If you launched an ICBM from Moscow, our NORAD, Northcom sensors could detect it within seconds, and we could triangulate exactly the location of the launch. Therefore, a doctrine of attribution and retribution was possible. In this new paradigm, it is extremely difficult to actually get attribution, and it is even more difficult to identify how you'll actually extract retribution. So the old mutual assured destruction doctrine, which you will recall, is quite difficult to implement in the modern age.
It is, and the imagery you've just posited is very dramatic. I mean, to equate it to a nuclear attack is dramatic. And I want to know then how, you're former CIA, you've been, you know, studying precisely responses to this kind of thing. How does the United States respond, and what leg does the United States have to stand on if it's engaged in the same kind of operation?
Well, first on the second part, the United States is not engaged in the kind of broad-based espionage that China is in this sense. And again, I'm not speaking now officially in a capacity for the United States government, but if you look at the breadth, the scale, and the duration of these attacks, they're targeted towards critical infrastructure. Again, the targeted effort, which I can neither confirm or deny that the United States did against Iran, if it did do so, was targeted exactly for that purpose, which is to take out the centrifuges that were developing enriched uranium for a nuclear program, not for disabling critical infrastructure that thousands of civilian lives depend on. And so that's a very clear distinction. The second point, though, to your broader question of how do we actually put forward a doctrine in this environment, the key thing to note is that the private sector controls 85% of this critical infrastructure. So it's not the government, really. It's at the end of the day, the private sector needs to be able to attack this problem. And the best way to attack a network that's attacking you is to have a network. And so right now, there's been an executive order issued by this administration. That Congress has not done anything to move forward on cyber legislation. What the private sector needs now is for the government to set the ground rules to enable it to fight a network with a network and then get out of the way. Let the private sector be able to address this threat and the best tools they have available to them.
Chad Sweet, thank you so much indeed for joining me.